Okay, well, I'm here once again with Marlene Seven Bremner. Marlene, thanks for coming back.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me back on the show, Brian.
My pleasure. I've changed the name of the podcast since the last time we talked. So you were on the Medicine Path podcast, and now we're called Howl in the Wilderness.
Oh, I like that.
Ooh, good response.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just kind of a little survey I take, but what does that name evoke for you?
A sense of wildness and freedom and connection with the unconscious, I guess. You know, the forest being kind of symbolic of that unconscious, unknown, mysterious, dark potentiality. And yeah, sort of a cry of revelry and connection with that aspect of the self. That's what it brings up for me.
I like it. I like your association. Well, I'm up in the forest here on southern Vancouver Island, and you're in a different kind of wilderness.
Yeah, I'm out in the desert, right at the edge of a very expansive desert here in New Mexico. It's sort of a forest, but it's like open woodland of juniper and pinyon. So there's lots of space, not a lot of shelter.
So when you're in your, was it a straw bale casita that you're in, something like that, or adobe, or?
It's straw bale, yeah, and adobe.
Okay, so when you're in your little casita there, do you ever hear cries in the wilderness at night?
Oh, I do. Yeah. We've got a lot of coyotes around here. We hear the hoot of an owl occasionally through the window.
Great. And so when you hear that, what's the usual response?
I don't know, it's exciting to me. I like to imagine them out there running around wild in the dark and hunting and reveling in their experience of nature and existence. Yeah.
Do you ever howl or hoot back when you hear that?
Sometimes I do.
Come on, admit it.
I do.
Yeah, me too. You're not alone. Well, last time, I'm just kind of amazed at what you've produced here. Last time we talked about your first book, Hermetic Philosophy and Creative Alchemy. And your second book has just been released, The Hermetic Marriage of Art and Alchemy. And they're both beautiful companion books. Like they just fit together so well. And just off the bat, I just want to congratulate you on completing these two projects. I'm kind of astounded at the amount of work that must have gone into creating these. What does it feel like to be on the other side now that they're out in the wild?
Well, it's pretty exciting. It's also a big relief for those to be completed and out in the world. And, now I have more time to go back to the studio and paint and work on other writing projects. So that's been really nice. And also, it's just exciting to have feedback from people that are reading the book, that are enjoying it and getting inspired by it. And, and the first one as well, and the positive reception that one has gotten. It feels really good. It was an awful lot of work and a lot of years that went into both of those books. So it's a good feeling that they're out there.
I'm curious about your process in writing these books. Well, in researching and writing, was the research going on consecutively? Did you set up a schedule for yourself every day? How did that work?
I mean, it was pretty much full on every day, all day for the most part. I really didn't have much of a social life, as people that know me can attest. I was really just doing the research and writing kind of together at the same time. But a lot of what had inspired the books was all these years of experience and research that had come prior. And then when I was in the full-time writing stage, the last 4 years or so. It was research and writing at the same time, and also sort of a synthesis of all the experience that I've had with this practice and with this material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you had already produced quite a body of work, mainly in painting, but I think you also do poetry and other writing as well.
Yeah.
Did the process of researching and writing these books give you any new insights on what may have come to you intuitively in your work practice?
Oh, yeah. I mean, a lot of the research for the history, both in the first book and the second book, was new for me, but I wanted to have that sort of foundation. So when I started doing that research and learning about these different ancient texts and also these different art periods that I wrote about in the new book, I just found so many rich pieces of, literary creations and visual creations and things that really helped to give examples for all the things that I had experienced for myself and to give them context. So that was a really neat process to go through and explore.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And how would you summarize the new book in relation to the first book? Yeah, like what inspired you to? Did you already conceive them as two books, or did the second one come after the first one? How did that work?
Well, originally I had wanted it to be all one book. So I wanted to talk about Hermeticism and the seven spheres, and then go into the alchemical theory and the 4 stages of the alchemical great work. But when I presented the idea to Inner Traditions, they asked if I could break it into 2 books. And at first I was like, oh no, this is terrible. But then I thought about it, and it really broke apart nicely into 2 different books. And so for the first one, I focused more on Hermeticism, the history of it, its development over the centuries, and how it relates to alchemical theory, and then a journey through the 7 spheres, because I really wanted to have those like full chapters on each of the 7 spheres, an in-depth sort of journey that people could go on and get immersed in to familiarize themselves with those energies and archetypes. And then, the second book ended up being more about the creative process in relation to alchemy and the alchemical great work. And as the historical segment, I sort of journeyed through these different art periods through the 19th and 20th centuries, to give examples for how artists in different times have both been inspired by the occult and by alchemy and magic, and how they've employed these practices in their own creations.
Just thinking about like the function of alchemical philosophy. Like for me, my interest in it is really that it provides such a rich set of images that describe a transformational process. So as a kind of renegade psychologist and someone who works with people, it can be really helpful to have those images to describe something that is maybe not so tangible or hard to conceptualize, but is really like a felt experience, or it can help us see that we're like, it helps orient us in a process that we're undergoing. How does it function for you? I mean, what's the benefit of learning about alchemy and alchemical philosophy?
Well, it was much the same for me. I mean, nowadays we have psychological terminology to understand these different processes that we go through, but the alchemists didn't have that. They just sort of had this intuitive understanding of the symbolic world and how to facilitate transmutations through creativity, through work in the laboratory, but also through art and poetry, which is a huge part of the alchemical history that we have. Very rich symbolic visual imagery, and then very encoded in symbolic metaphorical language. both in terms of like alchemical recipes, but also just poems about different alchemical processes and dialogues between, say, like Mercurius or Hermes Trismegistus or other, ancient wise sages and the alchemist who's practicing. And they're encoded in such a way that the words, they're not going to necessarily make sense to the rational mind. So there's a way of reading these texts that you can just allow the words and the imagery that is there to sink into your own unconscious, to sort of gestate within your own unconscious. And then through your personal creative practice and process, those things then begin to influence it. And that's how it worked for me. I just sort of started immersing myself in alchemical material and allowing that to saturate my own inner world so that those symbols and ideas could then be transmuted into something else that was coming from a personal level. So that's how I have worked with it and how I've written about it in the book. But, there's also just reading about like the 4 stages. Sometimes it's broken down into 3 stages of the great work. But most alchemists agree that there's like a 3 or 4 stage process that the perfection of the philosopher's stone goes through. And so that's a big theme of the book as well, and how that relates to the creative process. And yeah, there's various ways to look at those stages, but we can talk more about that if you have specific questions.
Yeah, I'd like to get into all those terms and have you speak to them in more detail. James Hillman, the psychologist, he thought that the benefit of alchemical images and language was that there's something about them that they're so strange that they defy literalization. Right. So they kind of confound the rational, literal mind and speak more directly to the soul. And so he saw that as a great benefit because he was kind of against literalization. And he also had an issue with the kind of abstract conceptual quality of much of the psychological language, like talking about the unconscious or the ego or the superego. They don't carry much weight. And one thing about the alchemical language is it's always speaking about something material, but doing it in such a way that, like you said, resists us taking it literally. And so they're these irrational images that also carry some weight, and there's a kind of visceral response to some of the descriptions. We can really more feel it than kind of get it with the mind. And yeah, I really appreciate that as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the images that you see, they're very dreamlike, and it's the same kind of thing that happens when you try to like rationally or literally interpret a dream. It just confounds the rationality. So you have to approach it in a different way, a more lunar way, so to speak, rather than a conscious, rational way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would like to get into some of these terms just to kind of lay some groundwork. So let's just go through them. So starting with the great work, the magnum opus. How do you, so if you could describe that from an alchemical perspective and then talk about how that relates to growth as an artist, or maybe even not just as an artist, but as a person who's interested in crafting a kind of a good life.
Yeah, so the great work in alchemy is the process whereby the philosopher's stone is taken from its sort of raw state and perfected through various processes to be able to transmute metals, so base metals like lead into gold. And so there's these various stages that the matter goes through, and all of the alchemists have different ideas for what that starting matter is. The materia prima, or the beginning material, the first material. But the idea is that you take that first matter and you subject it to a number of alchemical processes, and it transforms along the way. And eventually, the result is the perfected philosopher's stone, which is described as like a red powder, or sometimes as a tincture, or as a red stone. And this has the ability to transmute metals. And in terms of like the creative or the spiritual process, we go through a very similar thing when we're creating or when we're going through a spiritual transmutation. We begin with something rough and unrefined, and through various stages of perfection and refinement and transmutation and separation and coagulation, we bring this beginning matter to its final results. And in the creative process, we end up with something that we can project outward into the world, in the same way that the philosopher's stone is said to be able to, it's projected onto the metals, and that's how it transmutes them. And so our works of creation are then projected out into the world and multiplied. And there's more I can say about that, but on a spiritual level, it's a very similar thing as well. We reach into this sort of undifferentiated, undefined chaos that lies within us, and we're searching for that solid essence of truth at the depth of our being. And that journey takes us through all these different transmutations of the self as we separate, solve, and coagulate, into a new awareness, a deeper, more profound awareness of who and what we are at the end of that process.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, like when we start with well, not all psychotherapeutic work is involved in transformation. Sometimes it's about coping or adapting, but traditionally, if you go into analysis, so depth psychology, it's interesting to note that analysis means to separate. So we're looking for differentiation. So I think that's why Jung thought that alchemy provided a really good set of images and a model for the individuation process. Because when we come into therapy, we come in as this massa confusa, this coagulated mass of feelings and reactions and memories and experiences and traumas. And the first stage of analysis is to start to separate things out so that we can have a better look at things and differentiate. And then hopefully at some point, it all starts to reform into something that's coherent and multiple in its unity in a way. Do you feel like that's similar to the alchemical process? Like, is the final stage, is it something that is very singular, or is it more of a well-differentiated integration of all these different aspects or parts? Like, say, the elements or something like that. Like, do they still retain their kind of individuality? You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I see the final stage definitely as an integration and a union. And often it's described as the royal marriage of the opposites. So Sol and Luna, or Sulfur and Mercury, or the male and female, the active and receptive, yin and yang, these opposites that are quintessential to our nature, our being. And in the final stage, those come together and they're firmly fixed, this idea of fixation, where they're inseparable and they're impervious to fire. They're like just this solid awareness within the individual of the union of these two parts. And from that, a third thing is born. And that's this idea of this like divine child. And the way I see it,
right?
Child, the divine hermaphrodite who embodies both of these principles in one body. Is neither one or the other, but they're both existing in unity. And that child is also, I see it as like the magician who wields all of the elements at their command, So in that sense, the elements are also balanced between the polarities. So there's not this sort of imbalance within each element or between the elements, but they're sort of held within this in a balanced way, you know. And so an individual with that state of consciousness would they'd be in touch with all of the elements on a regular basis. You know, they'd be in touch with their body and the earth element, and their emotions and the water element, and their intellect and the air element, and their passion and energy with the fire element. All of that would be working synergistically for them. And with that marriage of the opposites, there's this continuous ebb and flow between the active and receptive. So an understanding that we need both the conscious and the unconscious. We need to be awake and we need to sleep. We need to be active and we need to be receptive. And just that fundamental understanding of that ebb and flow, and knowing when each one is necessary. That's how I see that.
Yeah. So how does that, like, where would you, in terms of a creative process, where does the Philosopher's Stone fit in? Like, what aspect of the creative process would that symbolize?
In terms of, say, one project, an individual project that you're working on, that Philosopher's Stone is the completion of that project, but not just the completion, but the new awareness that it engenders within you. Whatever is birthed within you through the completion of that project, that spiritual understanding, divine understanding that is then multiplied out into the world, projected out into the world through that creation. And then have the ability to transmit that state of consciousness that you attained through that piece of art.
Right. Yeah, that's what was coming to my mind, is that aspect of the projection of the kind of transformative force. So then the finished creative project would help you reach some new level of understanding or insight as the creator, and then sharing that with the world. Hopefully the work can then will work on other people who experience it in that way.
Yeah. And the idea that I attempt to present in the book is that the more that we can sort of purify and refine our own inner world, the more that those creations of ours will have the power to transmute the world and to benefit the world. So we do the inner work of transmutation and purification and refinement and all of that in order to create works that are of more impact and more benefit to the whole.
So the work, the creative work, is akin to the Philosopher's Stone. The creator, I mean, are we the confused mess that the Philosopher's Stone is looking to transform into a more coherent whole?
Well, the Philosopher's Stone is born from within that Massa Confusa. It's said to exist within it and all the elements as well, but just in a state of undifferentiation. And so as the creator, we're bringing order to that confusion. But we have to be able to access it, to open it up. And some people do that through analysis. Other people do that through the creative process, or sometimes both. But we open up that confused place within us, and with a curious attitude as to, you know, what's here and what wants to be born from this. And through the 4 stages of the great work, that comes into focus more and more. But I think we all access that part of ourselves at different times in our lives. It's always there, but sometimes we're really in it. You know, we really feel that state of confusion and loss of identity, and perhaps loss of inspiration, and just being overwhelmed by the lack of order in our own psyche, in our own world. And I think that's one thing that I emphasize in the first stage of the work, which is called the Nigredo, and has to do with, it's a very Saturnian, limiting sense of reality. dark night of the soul kind of thing. And the prima materia is associated with that. And so sometimes we experience that confusion and it overwhelms us and we become so identified with it that we think it's never going to end. But if we can accept it and sort of surrender to it and see it as the beginning of a process rather than an endpoint, like a death, which it is, but that death leads to rebirth. And it's just a matter of allowing it to be there and being patient with it and curious about it. And it will transform. And so that's a big, I write quite a bit about that first stage because I think it's really the most important and the easiest one for people to mistake for, you know, insufficiency or loss of self, or, you know, these things that we get caught up in. And yeah.
I think you said it, like when you're in that blackening stage, you can feel like there's no way out, that this is all there is. You know, it's really, you've hit the bottom. So can you bring in some more images from the Negredo stage to help people connect to it in their experience of life? Like I think about like lead and heaviness, the Saturnian, like depression, lack of vision. What are some other things that come to mind?
Yeah, I think there's a great image of an alchemist kind of huddled in this like dry valley with wind and fire blowing at him, and he's got his arms crossed, and there's like, I think, some crows in the background. So like crows and coffins and bones, ash, and yeah, the heaviness and the density of lead, the sort of dullness of lead, and all how that relates to the emotional world of like just feeling kind of dull and heavy and stagnant and limited. And it can feel like we're being assailed by the elements, you know, like I think of anxious depression or anxiety in general, where the mind just sort of is like attacking the self, the identity, and the sort of torment that induces. And all of these things are very quintessential part of the Negredo experience. And, you know, we've all been there to various degrees at different points in our life. I went through it to an extreme degree for a very long time. And that was sort of what led into writing these books, was just my experience with that and how I came through it. And it was through connecting with alchemy that I was able to put it into context. And so that's a big part of what I want to share with people, is like these experiences that we have, they have a purpose and they have a deeper meaning for us. And if we can get in touch with that, then there's a great gift. You know, the Philosopher's Stone is within that. And that's our great gift to the world.
Yeah, I think like one of the first lifelines that can reach us when we're in that dark, depressive, assailed state, it feels like it's never going to end, or there's, you know, nothing beyond this, is a kind of healing story, like the one that alchemy provides, that no, this is only the first stage in something like wonderful, actually, the first stage of a great work, the great work that is your life. And like that can be the first thing to save us when we're in that, right? And so even just that is like such a wonderful gift for us, because you know, kind of conventional psychotherapy doesn't really have much of that to offer. You know, they're kind of like treating the symptoms of depression or anxiety, but not necessarily bringing in a kind of a larger mythology or story that can put it in a bigger context, you know, put your suffering into this bigger context of transformation. And so even just that, offering that is great. So when you're in that state, now that you've come to recognize it, what are some of the ways that help you connect to the inner Philosopher's Stone, to begin to work with whatever's needing to be transformed at that time?
Yeah. Well, one of the first things I do if I'm in a state like that, whether that's like a creative block where I'm sort of lacking inspiration and ideas, or I just don't feel motivated to work on anything, or whether it's just, you know, anxiety about different things going on in my life that's becomes intense for a period of time. I kind of see that as an Negredo experience. Or like just a general sort of funk, a depression, you know, that I'm going through. One of the first things I do is pay attention to the dream world. And I do that on a regular basis anyway, but I start to pay a little more attention when I'm going through something like that, because often the dream world will convey some crucial information that I'm not able to see with my daily awareness. And it'll also sometimes provide like the root of some great inspiration that turns into a new piece of work, you know? So often that's what I'll do first, is look at my dreams, take an inventory of the different symbols and things that are arising and how those relate through my own personal associations to things I'm experiencing in my life. And then investigating from there and allowing that to sort of begin to inseminate my imagination, I guess, you know, those images and symbols from the dream. And often that'll be exactly what begins to transform that Negredo experience into something new.
Do you ever just start recreating some of the images that come to you in dreams, just to see what will happen if you just start bringing it out of the mind and onto the page or onto the canvas or clay? You know, just like kind of, well, like Jung said that the hands can work out, like working with the hands can work out problems that confound the mind. And he thought there was great value in just starting to make something of those images.
Yeah, I mean, occasionally I will sketch out a dream, or like in my dream notebook, I'll do a little sketch of something that was bizarre or interesting, you know. But then sometimes the imagery from a dream is so captivating and so haunting to me that it becomes a painting. And usually it's not a direct translation of the dream, because that's kind of hard to capture in one two-dimensional image, but it'll be some sort of integration of the dream that occurs over time that allows me to place it into a cohesive composition. But I have found that to be extremely helpful in like really unpacking what a dream means and integrating it on a very deep level. That really goes beyond the rational mind. And I can, like, you know, interpret it in a literary way, or like literal way, I mean, and describe it to people, but at the same time it goes beyond that sort of integration that comes when you do create something from the dream like that. Yeah,
I think we can you know, kind of interpret for days and kind of play with ideas in the mental sphere without it actually catalyzing any real transformation, you know, on the deeper levels that will change the way that we see the world and act in the world. So that's good to hear. So when you're like kind of working with those images, do you ever find that like new insights just kind of pop into your head as you're working out the images on the page?
Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah, and also new dreams will come along that provide new information, you know, that relate to the original dream. And yeah, I find I work very slowly. It takes me a long time to complete a painting, so that allows for a lot of new inspiration to come in. And also sometimes when I'm working in a spontaneous way, allowing things to emerge on the canvas without my direction, without my rational filter, there will be these surprising images and figures that emerge, and those have a lot of information to share as well. So then there's sort of a dialogue between my dream world that's ongoing, and then what's coming out of the painting through sort of unconscious means, and then my own personal experience. And it can be really interesting how that all plays out.
What's your conception of the imagination or imagination, do you think that these images live in some other space and they come through dreams or through like unconscious, spontaneous speaking or writing or art making? Like, how do you conceive of the imagination? Because some people just think of it as a faculty of the mind. You know, the
Mhm.
mind's able to create images and things like that. I kind of go with more of like what Henri Corbin talked about, the, you know, drawing from the Eastern traditions, where they saw the imaginal as another level of reality in between the material world and the spiritual world. And that really rings true to my experience, that it does feel like in my dream, I go to another place that maybe is even like next door to this reality or the source of this reality. There's so much interplay. But how do you think of, I don't like to say the imagination because then it becomes a thing. I think of it more
Yeah.
as a place. So
Yeah, I like that term, the imaginal world, as well, and I use that in the book. Um, I do think of it as the means by which this world is created, that it's all happening on the imaginal level before it comes into this dense level of reality. And, you know, I also think of the unconscious and the collective unconscious connected with that imaginal world. And so, you know, with active imagination, the technique developed by Jung, we can sort of enter that imaginal world in a conscious, directed way to facilitate communication. Or we can allow it to come to us through dreams or through sort of spontaneous fantasy. And in the book, I talk about the use of the imagination for transmuting reality. So going into the imaginal world intentionally and sort of planting seeds of things that we desire, things that we want to see come forth in this reality. So in a way, the imaginal world is like that massa confusa, the primal matter, in which everything exists in a state of potentiality, but it's not defined yet. So we're able to access that and influence it and sort of, you know, engender new potentialities within that through our own vision and our own dreams. And I also see the imaginal world as the place where all of these spirits and entities that we connect with on the Hermetic path, that they all exist in that imaginal world. Not to say that they're unreal. And I think that's where people get tripped up, is this idea that the imagination is not real. And that was a sort of Enlightenment era value that has really affected our connection with this fundamental faculty of being a human. To say, oh, that's just magical thinking. You're just imagining things. It's just your imagination, you know, to write it off. And alchemy was kind of cast aside in the same way, you know, it's nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. It's chemistry is all we need. That's what we got from alchemy. And so I think the imagination, the imaginal world is crucial at this time in our evolution as a species on this planet to reawakening a new enchanted connection with reality and connection with all things. So that's what I would like to inspire with these books, with both of them.
yeah, good. I'm a kind of an activist of the imagination as well. And it's become like kind of like an ossified faculty because of all the reasons that you stated, the kind of denigration of the imagination, even of dreams. You know, dreams are just like the mind processing the day's experiences, and they come out all confused and, you know, but it really is a source of something that we are really starved for at this time. And I think, you know, we're in a time of a global nigredo of a lot of the old structures are blackening and ready to die. And the imagination is going to be key, a key faculty or a place for us to access if we're going to give birth to anything that's new or transformative. Otherwise, we're just going to be repeating old patterns. So let's talk about the next stage, right? The albedo.
Yeah.
So once we've started to work alchemically in the nigredo stage, what can we expect from the albedo, the whitening stage?
So the albedo is kind of the point in the nigredo stage where you see that first glimmer of light on the horizon. You know, it's that first moment of like, oh, okay, this isn't going to last forever. There's something else that's coming. And it's not the full daybreak, you know, that's the kind of completion of the process. But it's that first glimmer of hope. And whereas the nigredo is associated with Saturn and with lead and the earth element and this sort of heavy, dense energy, the albedo is more about water and purification. And it's a very lunar process and also Jupiterian. So there's an expansiveness and a sense of being held within a greater body, like as if you were in the ocean, the mother ocean, you know. So it's a sort of spiritual awareness that comes. And, you know, when you come out of a period of the dark night of the soul and you're just coming out of it and you begin to see the light again, it can feel like a complete spiritual realization, you know, and you can almost feel like, oh my God, I'm at the end of the work, like I'm fully realized. But it's really just the first step out of that darkness. And there's work to be done because that water element is there to help us further break down and restructure these patterns that we've been playing out in our life. And we can think of those as like mental structures or the structures that make up our life. And like you said, on a collective scale, these, you know, sort of systemic structures of our society and our culture are all sort of breaking down right now. And we're in that nigredo stage, but the next stage would be where we sort of get in touch with the higher vision for what we would like to see in our collective experience and purifying those old structures and reworking them. And so that's what the albedo is about. It's about kind of washing, cleansing. And if you think of the way that salt, which is it's a Saturnian substance, breaks down in water and dissolves and becomes one with the water, that's sort of a good image for what's happening in the albedo. It's like these rigid structures, they're breaking down, they're opening up, there's a release and an emotionality to it, and a healing in that, and a sort of connection with something greater that helps us to aspire to something new, so we can start to restructure those forms within ourselves.
Yeah, so moving from a state of stuckness to a state of things start flowing again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there can be like a lot of inspiration and beginning to see the world in a more symbolic way, connecting with the imaginal realm. Yeah, less of a defined boundary between the inner and the outer world.
Yeah, I can notice that in myself and in people I work with, that coming out of a really dark, stuck period, maybe the dreams start to come through a little more strongly, right? It's like that flow from the imaginal or the unconscious is starting to happen more. Like there's been an opening. Yeah, that's interesting. I also think about like maybe at the kind of later stages of the nigredo, maybe there's a grief process that needs to happen in order to open up the watery element. I think the salt in the water being like tears of grief, that maybe being like a necessary stage to open up into the albedo, into the whitening. What do you think? Yeah.
I totally agree. And on a, in my own personal experience, there have been times when I just feel completely assailed by anxiety or depression or whatever it is, and sort of stuck in this place. And the second that I kind of surrender and just let myself feel it and just get into the emotions of it and just be with it and cry, you know, whatever it takes, that's the moment that it goes into the albedo. So I think there's something to that element of grief and expression and release that either leads into the albedo or that comes with the albedo. And again, this watery element of the tears falling and that release as we just simply allow ourselves to feel whatever it is rather than resisting it, which is, I think, where a lot of the problem comes in, is that we're resisting it.
Mm. Yeah, I'm also struck by that movement from Saturn to Jupiter as well. So from this patriarchal god of time and constraints
Yeah.
to Jupiter, who has a kind of significant placement in my astrological chart, but expansion, bigness, the big guru planet, like carries a lot of weight. There's like a joy associated with Jupiter, I think, too, for me at least.
Yeah, joviality.
Right,
Yeah.
joviality by Jove. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay. So then some systems say that there are 3 stages to the great work, and others add a little more detail with the 4th stage of Citrinitas, this yellowing stage. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I included the Citrinitas. And I think it was a sort of adaptation in later years to do away with that 3rd stage, the yellowing, and just go straight to the reddening, which is the final stage. But I think the Citrinitas is really important because it represents a phase of both transition and maturation. And also, I think it helps us understand these processes because they also relate to the seasons, you know. So we've got the Nigredo and the death of winter, the albedo in the springtime and sort of blossoms unfolding and the spring rains falling, and then the summer where things are maturing and ripening and growing into their effulgence. And the solar inspiration is coming in, and that's where that yellow quality comes from. This idea of the solar gold of consciousness coming in and fertilizing the waters of the albedo and bringing that first connection between the solar and the lunar principles, where something is being gestated and something's going to be born with that final stage in the rubedo. But first comes this stage of development and also of integration. So everything that we confronted in the Nigredo, sort of processed and purified and healed in the albedo, is now being integrated in various ways. So we can think of integration as like in a physical level, like engaging the body, and also practices like active imagination, where we can say, okay, so there's this aspect of myself that I want to get in touch with through the imaginal realm. And I'm going to apply my conscious mind to this, to do this intentionally and have a dialogue with this sort of unconscious aspect. And so that would be a psychological way of engaging with the Citrinitas and the yellowing. And creatively, it's like a time when our project is sort of really starting to coalesce, really starting to come together. It's not quite done. There's still work to be done, but things are really starting to cohere into like a solid form. Like we're getting close to that final product, final phase.
Mm. Yeah. So like in the albedo, there's this opening, a flow. So it can be maybe in a more of an emotional stage. And then in the Citrinitas, bringing more consciousness to the experience. So maybe gaining deeper understanding of what's been going on, what's been happening.
Yeah. And I think one point I'd like to make is, you know, with that albedo phase, it's very lunar, right? And so we think of water and lunacy with the moon, right? And this sort of danger of spending too much time in that lunar realm, getting sort of immersed in a state of dissolution and not knowing how to find your way back. So the Citrinitas represents that ability to kind of come back to dry land, to put your foot back on the shore and say, okay, this is what I've retrieved from that great ocean. And now what am I going to do with it?
Hmm. So maybe more a time of like self-reflection, contemplation, um, something like that. That could
Yeah,
help that stage along.
yeah, definitely. I've experienced it in my own process with a painting that I get to a certain point. I've had all this inspiration. It's been really exciting, that sort of albedo, like flooded with symbols and imagery, and it's all coming through and wonderful. And then I get to a point where I don't know what to do. I'm not sure what the next step is, and I need to let it gestate. And that's how I've come to see it, is like, okay, this painting is ready to just develop on its own without my um, interaction with it. And I can maybe look at it from time to time and like contemplate it and meditate on it and await that moment where I just know like what the next step is. So I imagine other people would have a different experience of that. But I think about gestation and just the patience that's required to let something develop without interfering with the process. And at the same time, on an inner level, the Citrinitas is really about engaging the conscious with the unconscious. So bringing that solar principle and shining a light upon the shadowy lunar world, and saying, okay, what's here? And what are we going to do with this?
Hmm. Yeah. So even like you were describing before, working with the contents of dreams, that could be part of the yellowing, getting them on the page, letting the images work on you, seeing what they have to say, what they have to bring. Um, mhm. uh, what planet is the Citrinitas associated with? The sun?
Well, definitely the sun. But in terms of the ordering of the spheres, the next one would be Mars that we encounter.
Hmm.
So that fire element, the increasing heat, I often talk about the fire element in terms of our own attention in the work that we're doing and our own intention for why we're doing it. Um, and the intensity of that and how that works upon the matter, whatever it is that the matter is for us. So the Citrinitas is an increase of that fire element and the Mars quality of passion and activity. And yeah. Also in the body, under the system that I studied, Mars is related to the upper digestive system. So the hottest part of the body, the fire, the acidic fire of the stomach and the heat of the liver, and these like very powerful transmutative processes that are going on within us. Also the center, like the core of our being in the solar plexus, and where we project our like confidence and ego and personal will. And so as we're moving up from the sort of encounter with death in the Saturnian Decreto, and then the expansion with the Jupiterian Albedo, this is a more of like activating principle. And that goes along with the solar inspiration, or like this idea of a heavenly divine quality kind of coming down and infusing itself into a latent material and bringing it to life.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you want to move into the final stage?
Sure, yeah.
Rubedo, reddening. I mean, I get it. Like some people, like especially in this kind of like post-enlightenment conception of things, purification seems like some kind of end goal, like the whitening, the founders of America, a lot of them were Puritans. And a lot of New Age spiritual people think it's all about purifying. So you might think, well, that's where we stop. We go from black to white. But no, there's more stages, and like the end stage is actually a reddening, which is curious. So what can we expect from that stage?
So yeah, the yellowing is often described as sort of a transition as the stone goes from the color white and it becomes tinged with that solar principle and then turns to red. And some people, some alchemical texts describe it eventually going into more of a violet color. But most of the time it ends in red. And at the same time, it's a union of the red and the white. And so, as we talked about before, the final stage is where the sulfur and the mercury are united, they're wed, and it gives birth to the divine androgen or the divine hermaphrodite who embodies both polarities in one being. And so there's that aspect of the final stage, which is that coming together, that final fixation of these opposing energies of the self. And through that union, there's like great power that's found within the individual, because we're not fighting against ourselves. We're not opposed within. We recognize both sides of our being, that we have both masculine and feminine principles within us, active and passive, solar and lunar. We are the king and the queen and the child born from their union. So there's that sense of completion on a spiritual level. And then some of the other processes I talk about in that chapter on the rubedo are multiplication. And so that's a process of further refinement of the stone. So by this time we have our stone and we're in the final phase of like bringing it to perfection where it can actually have the power of transmuting metals. And creatively, that would be the refinement of the imagination so that we can enter the imaginal realm and infuse it with our own vision for reality, for things that we want to experience. But at this point, things have become so divinized and so connected to the above. The connected nature of the above and the below exists within us. And so we're not acting just out of personal desire, but our personal will and our personal desire is aligned with something higher, so that what we're manifesting through the imagination is also for the benefit of the greater good. So multiplication is sort of a concentrated reiteration of those 4 stages. So it could be a period where we feel like all of a sudden we're going back to the Negredo, and yet we're still within that final stage, but we're re-experiencing that death and self-questioning and doubt again. And I've often experienced that in a creative project, where I'm right at the end and all of a sudden it all seems to fall apart and I don't know what I'm doing, or I suddenly question everything that I've been working on, and there's a sense of like loss of identity and meaning and connection with the work, all of that. But since we've already gone through these stages, it goes a little faster because we've encountered this before. So we can say, okay, I know that this isn't the end. This is the beginning of something. And so the multiplication can be done as many times as you want. You go through those 4 stages, further refining and perfecting that work or whatever it is that you're doing within the self or creatively. And this increases the power and the potency of the stone. And I often think of the stone as a synonym for both gnosis and true self-knowledge, divine knowledge of who and what we are and what our existence means, but also as the true imagination, the refined and perfected imagination. And so once we have reached that full potency, then we test out the power of the stone through projection. And the projection is then when we apply, in an alchemical sense, the red powder of projection is applied to different metals and they are transmuted into gold. And because of the multiplication process, just a small tiny bit of the powder will have the ability to transmute a great amount of lead into gold, for instance. So in terms of the imagination, that's really where we're able to transmute reality directly through the imagination. It's direct manifestation. And it all comes through that journey of going through those 4 stages and refining it and kind of separating out all the stuff that is coming from our base nature, you know, and divinizing it and understanding the true nature of what we are, the essence of what we are, distilling that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the revisiting of the kind of previous stages. Yeah, I feel that too. I mean, just when you think it's about ready to be birthed, the doubt comes in like, oh, I mean, am I on track here? Have I got this all wrong? Are people going to care about this? Do I care about this? All that stuff. But like you said, kind of having gone through it before, you come back to it with like more awareness and maybe skillfulness, like how to navigate those waters and kind of accept that, yeah, it's that's another benefit of having this kind of myth or story of this transformational process. You can locate yourself and go, like you said, like, okay, I've been here before. I know this is another stage that needs to be gone through. So you can go through it with like a bit more ease, perhaps. And now, in terms of the great work, as it applies to us as creative beings, what do you think we're here for? I mean, why go through all of this? Just so we can feel happier? I mean, do you think there's a greater purpose that I mean, because we're also we're unique beings, I think, in terms of being creative, but also self-reflective and being divided, I think, needing to make a coagulation, a reunion. You know, I don't think any other being on earth is striving for union with source or nature. I think our separation is what makes us kind of unique in a way, and to be tasked with making a work of our lives rather than just living our life. So, why? Why are we here, and why do we have to go through all this? I mean, that's a kind of a big question. It's a philosophy of life question, but
Well, I'll give it my best attempt. But the way I see it is that we are the creator experiencing itself. Each and every one of us, in our uniqueness and individuality, we are a window to that one unified being. And we're all a part of the dream of this greater being that we exist within. Everything that exists in this reality is within that body. So essentially, everything is alive, everything is conscious. And yet we're having this experience of separation and multiplicity and division. And our great task is to find that unity again. But to be able to find it, we can't just go back to it, or else, if everything goes back to unity, then all of the wonderful dream of this world and universe would disappear, right? It would just be absorbed into that unified state of
oneness.
Yeah. So
then we're back where we started.
Exactly. I think our task is to get as close to that unity as we can, or sometimes maybe we experience it for brief glimmers and moments, and to bring that into the multiplicity, and bring that into our everyday reality in our relationship to other people, and to constantly, remind ourselves that at essence, everything is one. And so all of the conflict and all of the sort of projections that we, put onto other people and things like that, we can slowly begin to reclaim. And my hope is that that's sort of the key to bringing a more peaceful future on this planet. And the Surrealists had a very similar vision, which is, to find that place of unity between the opposites, between the above and the below. That's sort of seen as like a solution to war and conflict. because the root of all of that is really our inability to accept the darkness within ourselves and our desire to project that outwardly in the form of the great enemy, you know.
Mhm.
And we all do that in different ways. So I think our task, and we do this creatively, spiritually, and just the way that we live our lives, but is to access that unity and infuse it into the multiplicity. Yeah, that's the best I can put it in this moment.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The attempt anyway, like it's a
Yeah,
tough question, right? But I think it's what we kind of philosophical types, what we wrestle with. Um, what's this all for?
yeah.
And I'm with you. Like the best explanation that I've found is that we are here to appreciate the creation, and that's the function of our separateness, combined with our consciousness, is that we're able to appreciate and to participate in the ongoing creation of the dream of
Mhm.
the creator. Um, and so I'm not such a big fan of like coming to some unity with source, because then I think we're not doing our job of being the appreciators, you know, the ones who adore creation.
Mhm.
It's the only good explanation I've heard for why we have this, you know, kind of a consciousness that's developed in the way it has to lead to a feeling of separation. Um, I think that's for a reason, like you said, so that the creator can enjoy its creation. Because if you're in a state of oneness, there's no relating, there's no
Mhm.
relationship anymore, right?
Mhm.
Um, yeah. And then in terms of like resolving conflict, I think that just helps us to better be in the flow of creation. Then we're not involved in the act of destruction, right? And so the recognition of why we're here on Earth as these creative, conscious, fucked up human beings, uh, we can get back to that great work.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Well, we've got a, you know, talking, this is very alchemical. We've got a guy pulling up in our driveway right now to clear out our septic tank.
Oh yeah, the
Yeah.
putrefaction.
But I like where we've gone in this conversation. I'm just noticing it's already been over an hour. Feel like we've been outside of time.
Yeah, it has
Um,
felt like that. Yeah.
Now the beeping truck is probably telling me like it's a good time to wrap it up. And
Sure.
now Suki's awake, and so the spell is broken for me over here. But I'm really glad that we got there through those four stages. And I thought
Yeah.
you did a really good job of relating to how they can show up for us in our life and creative process. Uh, of course, there's a lot more in these two books.
Mhm.
I think, you know, the thing that you've contributed to the Hermetic or alchemical corpus is uh, really making that correlation between alchemical philosophy, Hermetic philosophy, and creativity. And so if people are interested in that, I think these books are just a great resource, because you cover like all the kind of the systems and the stages and the correlations between planets and chakras and colors. And I mean,
Mhm.
you kind of cover it all. So good resource books for people who are interested in any of what we've talked about, which covers a great deal.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much more in the books. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
hopefully this will just be a good little taster for people. Now, do you have any plans for, because I think like when you produce books like this, they can serve as a great foundation for the rest of your own magnum opus, your life's work. And so do you have any plans for doing any workshops or teaching around this material?
I do. That is in development. Since finishing the books and doing, the promotion of the books and stuff like that, I'm just really happy to have time in the studio. So like
Yeah.
developing courses has not been my main priority, even though people are asking about it a lot. But it is on my agenda and I will get to it, I promise. Because I would really love to engage with people in a more direct way and to explore these things in a class setting. So that will happen eventually. But right now I've been focusing on just developing work in the studio, but also writing for my Patreon blog. So if people want to tune into what I'm working on right now, they can join me on Patreon, which is really just $1 a month to access the blog, or you can contribute more if you want to receive different rewards. But right now I'm doing a year-long decan walk. So I'm exploring the 36 astrological decans, which is something I touch on in both of the books, but I don't really go into a lot of depth on it. And so this year I started with Aries, and now I'm on the last decan of Cancer, which I'm working on currently. And just writing a little post about each one and the magical uses of the decans, the imagery associated with them. It's a really rich tradition that spans many centuries and really fascinating and weird. So I'm trying to learn about it and deepen my understanding of it, and in the process share that with others on Patreon. So
Great. Patreon.com/
I think it's 7 art,
okay.
I think, or you
I'll
can
figure
just
it
do
out. I'll put a link. I'll
Okay,
put a link
great.
down
Yeah,
below.
if you could have like, I can never remember.
Okay.
And
Well,
then,
that
yeah, if
sounds
people
great.
want to
Yeah.
learn about the books, they're on my website, and that's just Marlene7Bremner.com, or you can go to innertraditions.com and look them up there. And they're also available on Simon and Schuster and all these different distributors, Amazon, all of that.
Yeah. And look, people, just get the pair. Okay. They go together like the sun and the moon. So just get the pair, and they'll make a nice addition to your library. I promise. And there's beautiful full color plates of your artwork in there too. And some of those weird old alchemical drawings and all the cool diagrams and everything that as a designer, I love,
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks again for sitting down with us and howling in the wilderness from the desert of New Mexico, hear it all the way up here in the coastal rainforest of Vancouver Island. So good to come together.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me on the show again. It's been a true pleasure talking with you. And yeah, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks. We'll see you down the road. Take
All
care.
right.